It was the morning of June 1st at 6:40. On the sky of Kana, the first rays of the sun were just touching the horizon. There was a slight dampness in the air and a stillness, as if time itself had stopped. In the villages, people were just waking from sleep. Some farmers carried water pots towards their fields, while some mothers prepared breakfast for their children. In the midst of these peaceful and beautiful morning moments, suddenly an explosion shook the entire atmosphere. This was no ordinary blast. It was the beginning of a transformation. A targeted and powerful airstrike had been carried out on a secret terrorist camp near the border of Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. Within moments, the area once considered a safe haven for terrorists was filled with fire, smoke, and screams. Trees caught fire, underground shelters were destroyed, and every movement inside the camp was wiped out within seconds. This operation was more than a military strategy. It was a powerful message, a symbol that the era of forgiveness had ended. For years, the northern and eastern regions of Burkina Faso had been engulfed in terrorism. Locals went to sleep each night thinking it might be their last. These groups crossed borders without hindrance, attacked villages, burned schools, destroyed mosques and churches, and ambushed national forces. The common people's trust in the state had collapsed. In their eyes was fear, on their tongues silence, and in their hearts helplessness. But now, the scene had changed. This airstrike was not just about destroying the enemy's stronghold. It was meant to awaken the nation. It was a message that Burkina Faso would no longer bow. The terrorist will would no longer prevail. Those who hunted for years would now themselves be hunted. Those who hid in the forest would now live under the shadow of fear. And leading this transformation was an extraordinary leader, Captain Tarore. Captain Tarore was no ordinary soldier. He was a mind, a vision, and a revolutionary spirit. Under his leadership, the army of Burkina Faso was no longer just a defensive institution, but a beacon of hope for the people. He did not merely change military strategies. He uplifted the spirit of the nation. The day fire rained from the skies upon the enemy was not just a military success, but the dawn of a new history. Villagers came out of their homes. Some looked at the skies through binoculars. Others raised their hands in gratitude. On the lips of the elders was one sentence: "At last, we have answered." The airstrike of June first stunned the terrorists, but the true essence of this operation was yet to be revealed. The lands of northern and eastern Burkina Faso, once trampled under the feet of terrorists, were now going to become fields of honor and dignity. Captain Tarore had not only reorganized the army, but also reshaped its role, its direction, and its purpose. This was no longer a defensive struggle. It was now an aggressive, organized, intelligence-driven campaign, every step designed to cut the enemy at its roots. Between May 29th and June 3rd, a long and continuous chain of ground operations began. The most striking feature of these operations was their speed and precision. The 15th Battalion, stationed in the mountainous region of Kana, reacted immediately to intelligence reports. A group of enemies was trying to infiltrate from Ivory Coast. The battalion not only blocked the passage, but set up an ambush at a point the enemy could never have imagined. As soon as the terrorists entered, fierce fighting broke out, and within moments the enemy was erased from existence. This was the first signal on the battlefield that under Captain Tarore's orders, enemy moves would no longer just be stopped, they would be countered with deadly force. Meanwhile, the 9th Battalion, deployed between Dori and Tabarco, began a secret surveillance mission. Intelligence suggested that terrorists were trying to build a new supply line. This was the same region where in the past, military convoys had been ambushed many times. But this time, the danger was already under control. The army closely monitored enemy movements in the thick bushes. When their ammunition-filled vehicles reached a specific point, a perfectly coordinated strike was launched. Not only were all the vehicles destroyed, but the terrorist core plan was reduced to ashes. The 10th Battalion, patrolling in the Solomana area, also proved that the army was no longer simply reacting, but surprising the enemy. A patrol team came under sudden attack, but the outcome was not what the enemy expected. Despite heavy fire, the Burkinabe army not only held its ground, but drove the enemy back with a fierce counterattack. A stolen military vehicle, missing for years, was recovered in this battle, as if it too wished to return to its army. These three operations, though seemingly separate, were in fact links of one chain. The central principle of Captain Tarore's strategy was this: entangle the enemy on multiple fronts at once, choke its supplies, render its intelligence useless, and implant in its mind the army's superiority. Now the war was no longer only physical, it had become psychological as well. The enemy began to feel haunted everywhere at every moment by the fear of a phantom guerrilla army. Wherever they went, they felt that the eyes of Burkina Faso were fixed upon them, and this fear was Captain Traore's greatest victory. At the start of June, as the mountainous and forested regions of Burkina Faso burned under the heat of summer, the enemy, undeterred by the scorching weather, was planning new infiltrations. But they had no idea that on the land of Burkina Faso, it was no longer just soldiers fighting. The sky itself had now united against them. The decision by Captain Traore to synchronize ground warfare with aerial strikes was revolutionary, completely different from conventional warfare. Now, military operations were not limited to villages or borders. Those enemy strongholds that for years had been considered unreachable were being rained upon from above with fire. And more importantly, these attacks were not carried out by sheer force alone, but with precise intelligence, surveillance, and real-time monitoring. Aerial surveillance began from the region of Djibo. In its dense trees, rocky hideouts, and seasonal streams, the enemy had established multiple secret camps. Intelligence units, aided by drones and night vision sensors, continuously monitored their movements. Within days, it became clear that in the area of Ta, there was a logistical base where fighters were gathering, weapons arriving, and future operations being planned. But the enemy had hidden all this under the thick shade of the forest. They believed the canopy of trees would protect them, but Captain Traore's air wing knew well that the eye of the sky never blinks. Finally, one morning, a piercing sound ripped through the air, and within moments, the entire Ta base turned into a sea of fire. The place where the enemy had slept in calm now lay in ruins of corpses, burnt weapons, and shattered tents. This was only the beginning. In Sergesoma, considered a safe haven in the south, an airstrike targeted a large rocky compound. For years, this place had been used by militant leaders for their meetings. The strike was so swift and silent that the fighters inside could not even react. In seconds, the entire building was reduced to rubble. Then came the region of Bobo, known for its thick bushes and rocky cliffs, considered invincible. But when guided missiles rained from the sky, the earth itself trembled. Enemy barracks, ration stores, and secret shelters were systematically destroyed. The greatest impact of these strikes was not only physical, they were psychological. A new fear had gripped the enemy's mind, that no place was safe anymore. Not night, not forest, not buildings, not mountain hideouts. Every movement, every gathering, every plan was in danger. The precision of these attacks also proved that Burkina Faso was no longer just fighting, but winning with strategy. The sky was no longer only a symbol of weather. Now it had become a sign of terror for the enemy. And the architect of this fear was none other than the man who walked silently on earth, but had awakened in the hearts of his people, Captain Traore. After victory on the battlefield, the enemy often changes its strategy, and so it happened. In the second week of June, as Captain Traore's operations kept succeeding, the enemy began weaving a new conspiracy. In the dangerous and complex forest zone between three countries' borders, known as the Three-Border Forest, enemy elements secretly started regrouping. This region was naturally dense, perilous, and thought to be somewhat safe from modern technological surveillance. Here, the enemy gathered a large number of fighters, brought in new shipments of weapons, and believed that Burkina Faso's air force would be unable to strike inside such a deep forest. They carried out drills without fear, gathered at night with maps, and planned a massive assault the following week to recapture border areas. But the enemy did not know that now the sky was watching their every step. Drones constantly monitored them. A high-resolution video feed confirmed for the first time that more than 300 terrorists had assembled in a central spot within the forest. In Captain Traore's operations room, there was complete silence. All eyes were fixed on this video feed, and then the decision was made. Before the break of dawn, as the fighters were still securing their positions, a terrifying sound shattered the stillness. The first missile struck directly at the site of the main gathering. The blast was so powerful that tree trunks were flung into the air. The fighters, unprepared for cover, ran around in panic, but they did not know that death now lurked both beneath their feet and above their heads. The second strike hit their supply line. The third missile reduced their secret medical shelter to dust. And the fourth, it fell upon those few who were trying to escape the strike. In this operation, it was not only the enemy's bodies that burned, their plans, their courage, their confidence, all turned to ashes. The most astonishing aspect was that it was all carried out with complete silence, discipline, and technical mastery. No innocent was harmed, no accidental damage occurred. Captain Tarore's aerial doctrine was now clear. Capture the enemy, surround them, and destroy them, but with truth, law, and precision. This incident was not only proof of foiling a major conspiracy before its time, but also a message that the terrorists now had nowhere left to hide. The forest that until yesterday was their fortress had now become their grave. The dreams they had seen dissolved into smoke. Their maps had burned, and their once unbreakable resolve was now buried among shattered corpses and ruins. And the fire that rained from the skies, it was not merely fire, it was the roar of the nation's determination, Traore's vision, and the thunder of justice. For Burkina Faso, June was no longer just the season of heat. It had become the season of resistance and awakened conscience. As the enemy was repeatedly struck by air raids, as their secret strongholds were reduced to ashes, as their ranks scattered, for the first time a sense of defeat began to grow in their hearts. The terrorists who had once been fearless were now terrified by every tree, every bush, and every sound from the sky. On the morning of June 21st near Siba, an event occurred that was enough to change the course of this war. In a dense forest, a large number of enemies, nearly 1,000 militants, had gathered to stage a massive attack, but they did not know that their movements were already under aerial surveillance. Before dawn, as they were taking their final positions, disaster rained down from the sky. The first missile struck in the very center of their gathering. The earth shook, trees were ripped from their roots, and the enemy's confidence scattered like crushed leaves. Before they could recover, the second strike came, then the third, then the fourth. The entire forest had become a battlefield. The terrorists who once hunted others were themselves hunted that day. The survivors scattered in panic, but the sky pursued them. With every step they took, missiles fell as answers to their path. Those who managed to escape fled into the forest, wounded, starving, and terrified. But the forest was no longer their refuge. It had become their enemy. A few days later, on June 14th, came a moment that was an even greater triumph than victory itself. On the Eastern Front, an armed militant, holding his gun high, walked forward and surrendered before the army line. His voice trembled, but his statement was clear. "I can no longer fight. We are destroyed. Our leadership has collapsed, supplies are gone, and the death from the sky has broken us from within." This was not just one man's confession. It was the declaration of the enemy's entire mindset collapsing. After this, weapons were found abandoned across the forests, footprints of the wounded were visible, and enemy uniforms and rations lay scattered. The enemy was no longer hiding, they were fleeing. On the other hand, Burkina Faso's villages, which until yesterday were drowned in silence, fear, and despair, were now filled with a new energy. Villagers who once locked their doors at the sound of gunfire were now patrolling alongside the army. Young men began forming local defense units, mothers cooked meals for soldiers, and children were being named Tarore. A military officer, his voice thick with emotion, said, "We used to fight alone. Now when we enter a village, it feels as if sons are returning to their parents." This was not just a change in the course of war. It was a national awakening, a revolution made not by guns, but by faith, unity, and sacrifice. When the thunder of guns, the roar of missiles, and the enemy's screams gave way to silence, that silence was not of fear. It was of awakening. In Burkina Faso, people's trust in the state had long been shattered. After every terrorist attack, they felt abandoned and helpless. But now the landscape was rapidly changing. Not only on the battlefield, but in the streets, neighborhoods, and villages, a new spirit was being felt. Villages that had once been symbols of silence and helplessness were now becoming fronts of resistance. In sensitive areas like Mani, Sandu, and Sino, people formed voluntary defense groups for their own protection. Young men who had once migrated to cities were now returning to defend their homeland. The boys had learned to stand guard, and the girls had begun providing first aid to wounded soldiers. Every home was now not only a place of prayer, but also a bastion of resistance. One astonishing change was that local women, who were always considered to belong in the back rows, had now become the very heart of the struggle. Early in the morning, they carried food to military camps. During the day, they gave medicine to the wounded. And in the evening, they sat by the hearth asking one another about the soldiers' well-being. On their lips was only one prayer: may the protectors of our land live long. May their shadow remain over our children. Military officers said that now when they entered a village, they were welcomed not just out of duty, but with passion. People kissed their feet, children begged them to help make flags, and elders raised their hands in prayer, declaring, "These are our shields, these are our sons." The greatest reason for this awakening was not only the military victories, but the style of leadership. Captain Tarore never gave grand speeches, never appeared before cameras, never launched media campaigns. His method was simple yet powerful: act, deliver results, and never turn your gaze away from the people. His simplicity, honesty, and quiet service won the hearts of the nation. The impact was profound. In areas where once terrorists used to recruit, people now themselves pleaded to be enlisted in the army. The youth who once listened to extremist slogans now sang the national anthem. In homes, chants of "Long live Tarore" echoed. On walls, pictures of Captain Tarore were hung. Some mothers even named their newborn sons Ibrahim. This revolution had not come by guns. It had come by trust. When the hearts of a nation are one, when the people believe the state is theirs, when a leader sacrifices quietly and a soldier protects with his blood, then it is not only the enemy that loses, fear itself is defeated. And in Burkina Faso, this was exactly what was happening. Now the war was no longer fought only in the fields. It was fought behind every door, in every prayer, and in every mother's heart. And this was the true transformation, a unity born not of cannons and rifles, but of faith, sacrifice, and leadership. In every nation's history, there are moments when all past pains, present struggles, and future hopes are bound into a single name. For Burkina Faso, that name is Captain Ibrahim Tarore. He had become not just a military officer, but a vision, an idea, the architect of a silent revolution. His leadership pulled the nation out of despair, defeat, and fear, and now the people breathed in the light of hope, dignity, and victory. Tarore never called himself the savior of the nation, yet his actions gave him that place which no speech or slogan could achieve. Only sacrifice, wisdom, and sincerity. His presence had transformed the army from a collection of weapons into a living, breathing idea. Many senior political analysts and former military leaders declared him the successor of Thomas Sankara. Sankara was the revolutionary leader who freed Burkina Faso from colonial chains, sowed the seeds of self-respect and patriotism. But the one who nurtured those seeds and bore their fruit in the battlefield was Tarore. The boldest decision Captain Tarore made was to announce the withdrawal of foreign forces. Where past governments had relied on foreign advisors and troops, Tarore stood tall before the nation and declared, "We will defend our land with our own hands." At first, this statement was dismissed as a slogan, a political claim. But within months, what followed proved it was not words, but a declaration of action. Every operation, every victory, every airstrike, every advance on the ground proved that Burkina Faso's army was not only self-reliant, but skilled, organized, and effective. Traore's simplicity won the people's hearts. He sat on the ground eating with ordinary soldiers, placed his hand on the heads of the wounded, and stayed away from the media, believing only in work. His fame was not the result of campaigns, but of national service. This attitude shook the younger generation as well. Across the country, posters of Captain Tarore appeared. In schools, children began giving speeches about him. In villages, people hung his pictures in their homes, saying, "This is our protector, our hope, and our pride." Not only that, but long queues formed at recruitment centers. Those who once saw the gun as a symbol of hatred now embraced it as a sign of protecting the homeland. This was the power of Traore's character. He turned fear into loyalty and despair into passion. Traore proved that leadership does not mean only giving orders. True power lies in guidance, sincerity, and presence on the ground. And it was this power that revived Burkina Faso, when war is not fought with guns and bombs alone, but with hearts and ideals. And the victory gained in such a way is not temporary, it is everlasting. This was what was happening in Burkina Faso. The land where once terrorists roamed freely had now turned into a swamp for them. The continuous operations led by Captain Traore had left the enemy broken, scattered, and directionless. But the real success was not just that the enemy was fleeing, it was that the nation was awakening. From Kana to Siba, the regions that had once been centers of terrorism were now becoming symbols of peace and awakening. When military convoys passed through these areas, it was no longer fearful silence that spread, but enthusiastic chants. Village women came out carrying water and food, children ran alongside the military trucks, and elders raised their hands in prayers for the soldiers. On the doors of many homes, along with the national flag, a new picture was displayed, the portrait of Captain Traore, beneath which was written, "Our Protector." This was not just an expression of devotion, but a restoration of trust. For the first time, people felt that they stood with the state, and the state stood with them. Many villagers began to form local defense units. The youth started organizing night watches. Voluntary patrols were created to protect the fields, and even small children clapped when they heard the news of airstrikes. In schools, the echoes of patriotic songs could be heard. Teachers told the children that terrorism is not ended only with bullets, but also with knowledge, faith, and leadership. Farmers who once harvested their crops with fear lurking behind their backs now proudly said, "We no longer fear when we farm. This land is ours, not just on paper, but in reality." Alongside the enemy's retreat, their abandoned hideouts, weapons depots, and equipment became proof for the people that they were winning. In every village, a new story was being told. This place where the enemy once hid, today our army stands here. Military officers said that after every operation, when they entered villages, the locals embraced them like their own. A colonel said, "We have fought many wars in our careers, but this is the first time the people see us not only as protectors, but as their pride." This spirit was no longer limited to the army. Young men headed towards recruitment centers, and young women began offering voluntary services in medical and logistics roles. Some families themselves requested to send their sons into the army, saying, "We were born on this land, now it is time to give something back to this land." All this change was made possible when the people saw hope, sincerity, and leadership in Traore. And that hope had expelled the enemy not only from the battlefield, but from the people's hearts as well. Every war has a physical dimension, gunpowder, rifles, and bombs. But there are some wars that are fought within hearts and minds, fought over a nation's identity, dignity, and self-respect. Burkina Faso's war was no longer just about bullets. It had become an ideological struggle where the enemy's true target was not only the land, but the spirit. But they had forgotten that nations with honor, faith, and leadership can never have their spirit defeated. From the very beginning, Captain Traore had made it clear that this war was not against terrorism alone, but against the fear that the enemy had planted in the people's hearts. He had said, "We will first defeat not the enemy, but our own frightened minds." And that is exactly what he accomplished. When the enemy attacked, people once hid in their homes. But now those same people were ready to face the enemy. Once doors were shut at the sight of a military convoy, now doors open, tea was prepared, and young men dreamed of becoming soldiers. What greater revolution could there be? In this war, the enemy was not only losing ground, but something far more dangerous. They were losing their cunning, their psychological edge, and their strategies. Wherever they tried to hide, they found Burkina Faso's spirit, determination, and honor already waiting for them. The enemy was no longer merely being killed, they were becoming powerless. One incident stands as the best example of this reality. A young terrorist who had been involved in multiple attacks wept after being captured. He told the soldiers, "We thought you were weak, but it was your courage that defeated us first. We did not see corpses, we saw prayers. We were not broken by bullets, but by your resilience. This statement came from the lips of an enemy who once trampled over heads, and now he bowed his head, begging for mercy. The scene in Burkina Faso at that time was not merely a political or military victory. It was a spiritual revival. People felt pride in their hearts that they belonged to a land that had refused to bow. And when nations hold their heads high, the world is compelled to look at them. This war did not only change the enemy, it changed the nation itself. The children who once slept in fear of terrorist bullets at night now say, "At the sound of the skies, these are our protectors. They have come to awaken us." This was the war that was truly won, not with bullets, not with gunpowder, but with faith, honor, and courage. Traore's leadership proved that to lead a nation on the battlefield, one does not need a loud voice, but resolve, sacrifice, and silent service. And this spirit, this essence is alive today in every corner of Burkina Faso. Every war has an end, but every struggle has a legacy. And this war of Burkina Faso, with all its intensity and purpose, has now become the symbol of a nation's awakening. Where once the terrorist hideouts burned to ashes, now in the hearts of the people, a spark has been kindled that no storm can extinguish. When a nation learns to step out of fear and believe in itself, it not only saves its land, it teaches its future generations the path of dignity. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Tarore, not only was the enemy driven from the battlefield, but the people themselves were brought into it. Now, this war was no longer confined to military uniforms. It had become part of the farmer's plow, the teacher's pen, and the mother's prayer. Tarore never asked for applause nor presented himself to international media. But today, if France remembers its Charles de Gaulle, if America honors its Martin Luther King, then Burkina Faso must also remember, we once saw Sankara, and now we are seeing Traore victorious. And to remember this is not an emotional slogan, it is a responsibility. Because if we forget our benefactors, then our generations will have neither guidance nor purpose. The legacy of Traore, simplicity, sacrifice, and selfless leadership, is a lamp we must all keep burning. Traore taught us that no foreign power, however great, can withstand a united nation. He proved that when leadership itself stands in the field, soldiers sacrifice their lives with smiles, and the people pray with full hearts. His decisions, no matter how difficult or controversial, now live in every successful operation, every saved life, and every echoing chant in Burkina Faso. Now, the question is not what Traore has done. The question is what we will do. Will we reduce his sacrifices to mere posts on social media? Or will we teach every day, every step, every generation that this country is our identity, our responsibility? If you are a soldier, remember you do not only wear a uniform, you guard hope. If you are a teacher, do not teach your students to live in fear, but teach them that to die in dignity is better. If you are a farmer, sow every seed with the dream that this land is free and will remain free. And if you are a parent, do not only raise your children with Traore's name, but with his vision. Remember, this fight was not only of bullets, it was a war of the spirit. And keeping that spirit alive is the duty of us all. Traore carried the torch, now we must lift it.